The disciples beg Jesus, increase our faith. Do you ever wonder why they asked Jesus that question? Is that the kind of request that you would sometimes ask of Jesus? Lord, increase my faith. In our gospel context from Luke 17, Jesus has just talked about two things. Both the fact that temptations are sure to come, and if someone sins against you, forgive that person, even if he or she sins against you 7 times in one day. Forgive. So no wonder Jesus' disciples ask him, Lord, increase our faith. Faith is a gift of God, from God. Do you believe that? That faith is a gift from God? Or do you think it's something that you muster up within yourself? In Romans 12, Paul tells us, for by the grace given to me, I say to you among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned or given, distributed. Faith is a gift from God. We know that from an even more familiar verse from Ephesians 2. For by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not your own doing, it's a gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one can boast. Our faith is a gift from God. Since God always gives generously, doesn't that mean that we already possess all the faith that we need? And if at a later time we need more faith, God will give us more. Whatever we lack, God will supply. We can do all things in Christ who strengthens us. We know that it is a clear spiritual principle that God increases our faith according to our needs. This is a theory. I'm just wondering out loud with you. But is this true, do you think? That people who live only surface lives, facing no great challenges, following no great purpose, carrying no great burdens, giving little of themselves to others, never become deeply rooted in the grace of God. In that way, perhaps then they need no great faith, and thus they never know a great faith. Yet it's the nature of faith to expand, to meet our needs, and there's always enough. We draw upon the inexhaustible resource when we draw from God's well. John D. Rockefeller, of course, is one of the richest people of our country ever produced. There was nothing probably of material value in the world that J.D. Rockefeller could not provide for his children. But did you know, however, that he had a daughter who became obsessed with the fear, can you imagine, that she was going to die penniless? Her years were haunted with the fear that she would die destitute. Can you imagine such a thing? A Rockefeller worried sick about money. Even more so, can you imagine a child of God worried sick that he or she will go to God's well for spiritual resources in a time of need and find that well dry? God's resources are inexhaustible. Not only individuals, but sometimes whole congregations never venture out to do great works for God because they fear that the resources might not be there. In faith, we are living that out here at Ascension with Mission Possible, among many other ministries as well. Our faith is a gift from God. By the way, we have new children's bulletins, too, that are in the back, and I could have just said my sermon in one sentence, and it's right here in the children's bulletin. It says, God gives you all the faith that you need. That's it. The central problem of our lives is not our lack of faith, but I think our lack of putting our faith into action. It's what Jesus was getting at in our gospel reading today. In the language in verses 7 through 10, it's a bit obscure for us because we don't, thank God, have slaves or servants. But I'm going to read this time from the Message, a more contemporary translation. Suppose one of you has a servant who comes in from plowing the field or tending the sheep. Would you take his coat, set the table, and say, "Sit down and eat"? Wouldn't you be more likely to say, "Prepare dinner, change your clothes, and wait table for me until I finish my coffee, and then go to the kitchen and have your supper"? Does the servant get special thanks for doing what's expected of him? It's the same with you. When you've done everything expected of you, be matter of fact and say, "The work is done. What we were told to do, we did." Maybe you remember the end of that verse, a translation that goes something like this: "We have only done our duty." We've only done our duty. So let's reflect on that thought for a moment. I think so often when we do something we know we are to do, we feel like we should be thanked. I know I do. But then there's this teaching of Jesus saying, we have only done our duty. I'm so glad this week I remembered this old Jewish proverb that fits so well with this story. The Jewish proverb goes like this: should the stomach be honored for digesting food? Not at all. The stomach is not honored for digesting food because that's what a stomach is supposed to do. Although sometimes if we have trouble, we might honor the stomach. So likewise, a person of faith should not be expected to be honored for living a life of faith, love, and service, for that is our duty. So there's something to discuss with family, friends, life group this week. And I'd also like you to discuss in your life group this next point. When it comes to putting our faith into action, we seem to vary between two extremes. Some of us experience the paralysis of analysis. Until God gives us some special sign, we remain immobile. Our creed seems to be, don't just do something, sit there. It's amazing how many truly passive Christians there are in the world. Many of them can't even give God 1 hour a week in worship. And then there are a blessed few saints on the opposite extreme. They have a great deal of anxiety if they're not doing something every moment of the day. And so they stay busy even if it's with activities of life with little importance. Some of us are like that. We are ready to jump into action at a moment's notice, not because our faith compels us, but because we're uncomfortable being still. Those two extremes of passivity and mindless activity, neither one is the way of the cross, the way of the follower of Christ. For the supreme need in our lives is to involve our lives into meaningful service for God and for God's people. We need desperately to be driven by a vision of our God who gave God's self to us on the cross. Lately, I've often been quoting the missionary Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who said this: "I don't know what your destiny in life will be, but one thing I do know, that the only ones among you who will be truly happy are those who will have sought and found how to serve." Take Millard Fuller, for example. He was a successful lawyer, but he was dissatisfied. He had it all, and he decided that he had virtually nothing. One day he decided to do something about it. So he and Linda, his wife, walked out of the law practice, sold their possessions, gave money to the poor, and joined Clarence Jordan at Koinonia Farms, a Christian community just outside of Americus, Georgia. And with other Christians there, they searched for a focus for their lives that would have meaning. They began working to help some local poor to build adequate housing for themselves. And out of that grew the ministry called Habitat for Humanity. You know about them. Some of you work for them and work with them. President Carter, who just celebrated his 95th birthday this past week, has worked with a lot of them, pounding nails just like everybody else. And President Carter would say, "I have only done my duty." Habitat for Humanity is having a remarkable impact all over this country and in many other countries. The result has been nothing short of miraculous, both for the homes and for the changes in people's lives. It's kind of like saying to the mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea. It's that kind of faith. It's making that kind of a difference. And I'm happy to say that Habitat for Humanity will be our local project for our next month's Gifts of Hope. And we'll also spend a Saturday, November 23rd, building homes in Camarillo, Oxnard. You see, the problem for us, I believe, is not our lack of faith. The problem is our lack of action. We need to give hands and feet to what we believe, like we do this weekend with putting together Lutheran World Relief school kits. I don't know if you can hear the children behind you, but in the Founders Hall, the children from Sunday school class are putting together school kits. And you have the opportunity to do the same thing after worship this morning, for each person to do one school kit. In hundreds of lives of children around the world, miracles will happen. And maybe a miracle of the joy of serving will touch your life as well. Project Response is another example. The simple gift of a grocery bag of food may not seem much to you, but it makes a world of difference to a family struggling to put food on the table. We'll hear more about that at the end of the service. Caring Ones are mustard seeds as well. A $1 bill that you put into the offering plate, what can that do? But with all of you, it adds up to hundreds each month. And many in need in our community are blessed by your mustard seed faith in the giving of those Caring Ones. And I'm going to read to you a portion of a recent letter that I received from 2 recipients. Thank you so much for the help we have received from this program. I'm not going to say their name, but they say, we struggle at the end of every month. It's very difficult for us both being homeless and living in our car. Your program makes a difference for people like us. Thanks to the church and pastors with helping us with food and prayer. We are so thankful for everything. God bless. And this is one couple that each time I see them, they ask me to pray with them. Whatever action steps we take in response to God's grace in our lives, out of love for our neighbor, when we do that, our faith expands. When we care for God's people and for God's creation, our faith increases. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said that all we need is faith as big as a tiny mustard seed. It does not take a lot of faith to perform a miracle. Even the tiniest bit of faith will do, if that object of faith is Christ, who has all the power in heaven and on earth. What really matters is that we put the faith that we have to work. And later, if we need more faith, God will supply it. When we commit our lives to loving God, serving in God's world, and caring for God's creation, we see our faith grow as a tiny mustard seed to an enormous tree, and we witness miracles that we never dreamed of. Increase our faith, the disciples begged Jesus. And Jesus responded in a way by saying, you want to increase your faith? Increase your service, and you will find faith that you never knew you had. Your faith, a gift from God, amounts to so much more than meets the eye. In humility, we say as God's servants, we have only done our duty. So trust God to give you what you need. And step out in faith today to do that miracle you know that God is calling you to do. Amen.